I guess we are live. You can start, Sophia.
Okay. Welcome, debaters, and congratulations for reaching the Open Grand Finals at Credence, the JLU British Parliamentary Debate. I'm your chair, Sophia, and paneling with me are Mehul, Tulip, Unraj, Saval, Claire, and Thea. Debating on the motion, this House regrets the belief that time is finite. We now call on the Honorable Prime Minister. Here.
Hello, my name is Miggy. Am I audible?
You're audible.
Okay, thank you. I will be taking POIs by a voice, so kindly unmute. Pronounce he, him, they, them. I'll begin my speech in a few. I'll just set up my timer. Begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in a world where people are set on the idea that time is finite, that they only have a limited time to spend their lives in whatever manner they choose and in whatever way they choose to spend it and in whatever activities or projects they have in their life that they want to achieve. The reason why we regret why time is finite is because it burdens the individuals. Rather than looking at things in the long term, they look at things in the short term. They do not realize the fact that they can make meaningful contributions within their life, and these meaningful contributions can look past the time that is currently presented as finite to them. Now, before my arguments, let me move on to some characterizations, right? What exactly does this belief look like? Individual belief that they are only a limited time to do certain things, such as when a bachelor must graduate at 21, or when a basketball championship wants to be drafted, they have to be at a certain age, such as 17 and above. Or when you want to be a chess prodigy, you have to start at the age of 7 or the age of 10 and above, etc., etc. Right? But secondly, this is the belief that you only have a limited amount of time to achieve the things that you want to achieve, as I've said. If you wanted to address a certain issue, you have to address it now. If you wanted to create a certain movement, you have to start today, such as the feminist movement, so the Black Lives Matters movement, and various other movements where people believe that they have to start today and they have to continue this effort. When you want to build an organization, you must do it now. And if you wanted to start a family, right, you're constrained to the time that you have, that the time that you perceive. But thirdly, right, this belief looks like that you have a limited amount of time and that you need to allocate that time efficiently because that is all the time you have. People are limited. We panel realized that people are limited and constrained to this mindset. We believe that it is the belief that you as an individual are bound by time, that you are limited by the years that you have and the minutes that you make up in your life. Notice the opening opposition will probably come in and tell us that the importance of time is that it keeps us realistic. However, the main problem we have coming from opening government is that it prevents us from doing something very important, something that means more than the time that we are given, and that is transcending this limitation, this finite reality that we perceive. Right now, moving on to my arguments, I will be talking about firstly how this boxes people into their identities. Secondly, how this boxes people into their own legacies. Thirdly, how this boxes people into their own pains. And finally, the most important, that the most meaningful things in life will take more than just a lifetime, right? But firstly, moving on to my first argument, that this boxes people into their identities. If they've allocated too much time into this particular thing, they've been boxed into it, right? If they've allocated not enough time to this thing, they've been boxed out of it. We see this in examples such like when you've spent your childhood as a chess genius, when you've started at the age of 7 and you've won multiple championships, beaten a grandmaster, then you're boxed into this because you've invested so much time into it. We've seen this in certain cases, like when you've spent your high school and college years as a basketball prodigy, and the global coaches realize your skill, then they've drafted you at that certain age and you've invested too much time, then you have to continue with this path. If you spent a majority of your life building a corporation that you founded on your beliefs, then you're boxed in to this identity that you must continue, right? But secondly, my second argument, right, this boxes people into their own legacies, that individuals believe that they have the burden of maximizing the limited amount of time that they have rather than maximizing this time through other people, right? This is to say that I do not need to be the person that needs to start the social movement. This is to say that I do not need to be the person to start the organization that are founded on my strong beliefs, right? Because we value the strategy that people are able to wait for the time when the things are right to be able to create change, right? We value the strategy to pass on our legacies. First example of this, when a person decides in building a corporation or an organization, that then you can later on pass this to the family or any other reliable relative that you would like him to continue the legacy that your corporation has built and founded upon, right? Or more than this, when you work towards social change with others, because you know, and these people know that this battle is yet to be over in a couple of years or in a couple of decades, because all these people know that this is a battle yet to be won just in a single lifetime, right? But thirdly, moving on to my third argument, that this boxes people into their own pains. What do I mean by this, right? Excuse me. This is to say that individuals believe that things will come to pass, that whenever pain they come to experience in the moment is finite because time is finite. They're restrained to this particular idea that everything in their life is only finite, including this pain, because it will come to pass. The problem with this is that it creates a structural barrier that actively stops people from acting towards change. If we view time as a scar, two things happen, right? A, you will not bother to change the system because you know you can't do it in your lifetime, because you know you don't have the time to do it, because if you've already been boxed into the system, and if you've already experienced this pain and these problems, and you've already known that you don't have the time to deal with it, and why bother, right? But secondly, you won't do anything because you believe that it will come to pass, because this pain is only limited, and that you know this finite reality will come to pass eventually, so why bother deal with it? We think that this looks like people box into the reality that their grades are low because they can't do enough to raise it. We think that this looks like they box into the reality that they don't have enough skill to perform in a specific sport, so they won't do anything because they know that they think that they don't have enough time to develop these skills, right? We think that these are the primary reasons why we think people come to be apathetic in their lives. But fourthly, moving on quickly to my fourth argument, the most meaningful things in life will take more than a lifetime. These are endless battles that we will need to continue to pursue for forever, things like social movements, things like structural change. And if we want to be able to pursue such structural changes, we need to be able to play the infinite game of time. As long as these problems exist, we see that we have to change our mindsets, transcend the fact that it is a finite reality that we are living in. We see these cases in history, such as when historically the fact that the abolishment of slavery took place in along a huge span of time, and it was not only accomplished by one or two notable people. We think that this looks like also social movements such as the feminist movement, the LGBTQ plus movement, and the Black Lives Matter movement is still a battle that is continued to be fought and will continue to be fought by the people that believe in it and that people support it, because they know that this is a battle that will not last only for their particular lifetimes. And thirdly, grounded cases where people have their own little projects that they want to, right? But to conclude this, right, people need to see past their time as a finite life, and they need to know the value of a life when it comes to things like looking past their own finite lifetime and looking past the legacies that they have come to pass. You may have won the battle, but you haven't won the war. And it is for this reason that people need to realize the fact that they can make meaningful contributions throughout their lifetime, and that they aren't constrained to the battlefield that is directly presented to them. For all these reasons, we're very proud to propose.
We thank the Prime Minister for their speech. We now go on with the clash of opposition, calling on Leader of Opposition. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep, loud and clear.
All right, I'll just take 10 seconds if that's okay. Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, just a second. If someone from the panel could keep time, we can give them the permission to share their screen if they want to. I'm facing a bit of like power issue at my end, so if that is fine with any of the panelists to do so.
I can do that.
Cool. So do you need screen sharing permission, or will you be doing it manually by putting a text in the chat box?
Anything will work, like I can do either way.
Whichever you feel fine.
Okay, I'll just share my screen now. Is it okay? Like I'm operating from my phone, so I'll share the screen of my mobile phone.
Cool, cool, cool.
Okay. Yeah, can you guys share, see my screen?
We can
Is
see
my
your screen.
screen visible? Yeah, all right.
Yeah, it's visible.
And with that, we call on leader of opposition. You're here.
All right. I'll be starting my speech in three, two, one. Panel, contrary to what OG claims without grounding all their claims in reality, if we are able to prove to you today that time is the only thing that adds value to your life, making it way more meaningful, and the impacts that come out of it are extremely, extremely significant, we'll be able to take this debate. On that regard, few pieces of essential characterization, right? We think, what does this idea of finite time looks like? It looks like there existing a deadline to everything, to your life, to phases of your life, to everything that constitutes life around us, right? In that regard, this fination of time also makes you feel small as compared to the longer scheme of events. It makes you get locked up in your existential inertia, knowing that you cannot always be able to do what you aspire to, has multitude of benefits to it, which comes about as the impact on how people act, right? In that regard, six arguments that we have for you today, right? First, on the idea of how it leads to creation of legacy, right? We think survival is a natural instinct of individuals. The idea of self preservation to exist beyond the limitation and constraints that time put on us, the mortality that puts on us, the idea that one day I won't be able to be here today, creates an urgency to overcome the constraints of mortality that people anyway fear, to overcome the oblivion people already fear. In that regard, we think it becomes an important enough incentive for you to go ahead and create a legacy, right? To go ahead and create artifacts that transcend the time duration, to create and go ahead and create groundbreaking discoveries that you want to be remembered for, right? We don't think it puts you in a box, right? Because we think the idea of escaping oblivion is something that everyone aspires to, right? The reason I am doing this debate is because I want to come first in it, because if I don't, like, I know that it, like, I don't want to get lost in oblivion, which is which is the factor that is making me give my best today, right? In that regard, I don't see it as a deterrent in locking me up. It rather looks to me like the idea of creating a legacy, to leave behind something for me that's extremely, extremely important, that's extremely significant to preserve, right? Second line of argumentation, we think that it also creates a moral deterrence to not do bad things and to do good things in life, right? Why does that happen? We think that this debate takes place in a reasonable situation where religion, being the important part of significant part of 21st century that it is today, continues to say the same, right? We think in that regard, if you like, being like, not getting into the extremities of what status quo look like, religion is not altruistic, but it is also not extremely, extremely worse, right? In that regard, we think benevolence and sacrifice is something that religious scriptures anyway preach, right? What are the impacts of it? We think that the impacts are two layered, right? The idea of time being limited, and the idea of after that limited time there existing a concept of afterlife, and you being treated the way you act in this world in that afterlife, or the idea of hell and heaven existing at large, is the idea that makes you believe that if you go ahead and do bad things, you will be punished. If you do go ahead and engage in good things like charities and etc., etc., you will be rewarded, right? We think that most people in this world are not altruistic, and they are not their worst forms of themselves either, right? At a point in time, this debate does not take into account extremities, but takes place in a reasonable situation, we think it becomes an incentive enough for individuals to not engage in morally dubious activities. It becomes a very, very important moral deterrent, right? Third argument, in terms of cathartic value to people, right? We think that the world that we live in is the idea of being born is something no one consented to, right? And the sufferings that encompass our lived realities is something we never gave our consent to, right? In that regard, we think that people have to live various oppressive, or like people have to live various problematic and oppressive structures which they don't want to, right? In that regard, the idea that it is the time is limited, time is going to end, gives you some sort of cathartic value, not in terms of your life ending, but in terms of that phase of your life ending, right? The idea of you being able, if you are a poor person, if you're not able to provide for your family currently, or if you come from a deplorable background, if you come from a marginalized community, you being able to escape that structure of oppression just because the time and the idea, the concept of the meta concept of time attached to it is limited, right? Second layer of analysis, we think it also acts as an incentive structure for individuals to go ahead and break the chains of oppression that they exist in, right? At a point in time, trigger warning, if a woman is like literally facing domestic abuse, the idea that her time is limited becomes an important enough incentive for her, because she realizes that, hey, this is not the way I want to live for the rest of my life, right? This is not a legacy I want to live behind. This is not something I want to die with. I want to do something more with my life. My life can never be limited to just being a means to an end, to someone just being abused by someone. In that regard, the idea of individuals trying to break shackles of their oppression, not just on micro level but also on structural level, literally igniting social movements that bring about justice, that have been extremely important, come about, right? Fourth argumentation, we think that it also transcends to fragmentation of phases of life, right? We live in different fragments of life: early life, middle life, end life, which always encompass different kinds of sufferings, right? You, like, as a kid you have academic issues, at the idea of getting jobs or marrying at the later stages of life, right? The idea of time being limited, and hence those phases being limited, keeps you from getting overwhelmed, helps you get through it, because you know there exists a light at the end of the tunnel, there exists an end to it, right? But also, fifth argumentation, we think that it also makes individuals in, cherish their life a lot more. Why does that happen? It happens because the capitalist world that we live in literally treats us like cogs in the system, right? We are at that point in time, they want us, this capitalist structure want us to believe that whatever, like, limited time that whatever time that we have is for just going into their working for them and coming back to our home and repeating the cycle, right? At any point in time, we realize that the time that we have is limited. The idea of us to be able to escape that in order to experience true pleasures of your life, through the thing, in order to go ahead and engage in things that bring significant value to our life, also increases, right? Because we then don't defer this idea of happiness, don't defer these activities, we rather engage with them more, because we know at a point in time our time in the world ends, we will not be able to go ahead and experience all the beautiful things that we want to experience, right? Last, sixth constructive, we think the idea of life, this also helps people escape and cater to existential crises that pose to the world today, in terms of, say, nuclear artillery, or the idea of world ending due to global warming. The reason people collectivize and take action against it is the idea, because the time that they have is limited, and hence they want to defer the end, and for those reasons, extremely proud to oppose.
Thank you for that, LO. We now go on with the extension of opening government. Here.
Hi, just wanted to confirm that I'm audible.
Yep,
Hello?
you're clear.
Okay, with that said, give me a few seconds. I'll just set up my timer. Hi, everyone, by the way. My name is Scott. Feel free to call me whatever it is that you want to call me. And POIs in the chat. I will take one, assuming that I have the time. No promises, but preferably I would want to take one from closing for purposes of engagement. Anyways, with that said, starting my speech, ladies and gentlemen, in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ladies and gentlemen, we think opening opposition's case is basically that when time is limited, you start to manage it better by like realistically setting your expectations. That once you are 30, you should realistically prepare yourself and stop pursuing your dream. If you weren't drafted at 17, then you should give up on basketball. If you couldn't make your enterprise when you were 30, just stop, right? If you couldn't pursue a corporate career that you may have wanted to pursue at like by the time you were 29, well, it doesn't matter. You won't be able to do that anymore. If you are 47 and don't have a family, then don't pursue that. Ladies and gentlemen, the problem with setting expectations is the simple fact that while they are hard to defy, we think that there are certain instances where you are able to define that. And at the point when you opt into their narrative, you are unable to actually be able to do those types of things. Ladies and gentlemen, we think this is exactly the problem that me and my partner want to address. Precisely because the most meaningful battles in life, these are the ones that take more time than your life actually has. We think that the most meaningful changes are the ones that take the hardest battles, the ones that are most inefficient in terms of time. And at the point wherein something becomes finite, we think that that is the same point at which you too come to believe that you are limited and that your life is limited. Because a problem we often face when it comes to thinking about scarcity is that we force ourselves into thinking about how best we can allocate these resources. And the problem of this very economic perspective is that it boxes us into thinking about things that we can achieve efficiently rather than the things that we can achieve meaningfully. Because the most important battles will not and have not been won in a generation. We think that things like battles like racism, battles like sexism, battles like discrimination and hatred, these have been ongoing issues for generations, challenges that we have faced since time immemorial. And we think that the battles that are most meaningful for you to be able to fight are the battles that you will never be able to win within your finite life. And this is exactly why, in believing that time is limited, it is only natural for many people to become apathetic and to choose not to fight these battles. And we think, coming in from our side, that this is the structural reason why it took generations for us to be able to fight many of the battles that we have been able to fight today. We think that this is because for generations, many women thought that they did not have to fight for their rights because they will never come to see the benefits. Because even if they fought for it for like their whole life, they would never be able to achieve it. And that's going to be a waste of their time. This is because for generations, many members of the LGBTQ plus community thought they did not have to fight for their rights because they also will never see the benefits. Because even if they fought for it their whole life, they would never be able to achieve it. We think African Americans thought they did not have to fight against slavery because even if they did, they would fight their entire life, never come to see the benefits because even if they fought for it their whole life, they would nonetheless never be able to achieve it. We think that for any movement in history, the primary barrier to social mobilization is the belief that all of these structural barriers, that all of these immense challenges will take more than your life to be able to achieve, more than your life to be able to conquer. And that if it takes too long, that we ourselves will never come to see the benefit. And as a result, since our time is limited, we should allocate it better to more realistic things. And this is exactly the problem we have with their side, that it boxes you into the world that you live in rather than aspiring you to try to actively change that world. And we think that just extending this case even further, this is most especially true at like the micro level. We think this looks like, for instance, when you have an abusive male boss and you are a female, or when you are an African American going up against a white police officer. What is it that you are going to say? Why is it that these people concede? They say that me arguing with that police officer, that's not worth my time. Me arguing with my male boss, that is not worth my time because no matter how much time I give, nothing is going to change. And we think the problem with that is that you start to believe and you essentially start to be able to internalize that type of oppression. And we think that that is essentially the harm that ultimately happens on their side. They talk to us, for instance, about how maybe this woman would want to leave her husband. Well, in the converse, we would like to ask, what if this woman thinks that in her life she will never be able to challenge him? Because no matter how much time she allocates, she will not be able to challenge that type of structure. We think that this is exactly the type of thing that they need to answer. How it is they're able to get those bigger goals. And the very first reason, therefore, that we regret this type of belief that time is limited is precisely because it has set the world back in terms of social justice by generations. Because we would argue in the counterfactual, if these people would have had believed that they have an infinite amount of time, they would have started playing this infinite game much longer ago. What does this infinite game looks like? It looks like no matter how many times we lose, even if we never see the benefits within our life, that doesn't matter. We continue to fight, we continue to push because we recognize that anyways, time doesn't end with me. Time continues with other people, right? It continues with my son. It continues with my grandson. It continues with the fullest and broadest extent of human history. And that I am not fighting for myself and for my time. I'm fighting for theirs. I'm fighting for the infinite time that is ahead of me, precisely when that is precisely why we need to think that our time is limitless, right? And sure, you might be thinking, isn't this a purely social justice argument? I would argue, okay, we think that this is even more so true at the individual level, right? Because how many people push off things that they don't want to do because they believe that they don't have the time to do it, right? It's why I might not make my business because I think I don't have the time to be able to make it anymore. It's why I might not challenge the structure. It's why I might avoid like all the meaningful challenges that my partner talked about. And it's why we think people have been like this for generations. Because we think on our side, you do not value your time nor yourself as ends in and of themselves because you do not view yourself as a limited being. Rather, you view yourself as an end towards something much more limitless, towards other people, towards bigger causes, and towards the infinite spectrum of time through which we are able to create real change. Ladies and gentlemen, as an econ student, something we often talk about is the difference between the short run and the long run. And in the short run, there are certain things that you will never be able to change, certain sunk fixed costs. For instance, if you are currently in your job, you probably won't be able to change it in one day. In the same way, you won't be able to change a structure within like one life as well. These are things that will take an infinite amount of time. And when you look at things from that infinite long run perspective, everything becomes plastic, everything becomes changeable, everything becomes challengeable. And that is exactly the narrative and exactly the belief that we think society should have. In fact, we think if our society had it much earlier, we would have been able to challenge all of these structures at a much, much, much earlier point in time. This is because on our side, we do not think of time as a historical limitation, but rather as something that expands so infinitely that your life is but a speck in an infinite world, in an infinite timeline, and that hence your life only matters so much as you are able to give it to others. To my coaches, PJ and Nori, and to the contingent over at UANP, I hope I did you very, very proud. We are very proud to propose coming from OG, and we hope to take the championship. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that speech, DPM. We now go on with extension of opening opposition. DLO, please. Here.
Hi, can someone please tell me if I'm audible?
You're audible.
Perfect. Wonderful. Cool. I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel 3 ideas that we get on side opening government. Number 1, that you box people into their identities. Number 2, you box people into their realities. And number 3, you won't fight social justice causes because you simply think it's too insignificant for me to waste my time on. I'm going to engage with their best case, and like considering they haven't given you any counterfactual or any comparative, rather than saying infinite means that everything is challengeable, which we don't understand why is it so. I'm going to engage with their best case. On the first idea of you being boxed into your identity, therefore, for you to achieve a job at 21, become a chess genius or a chess grandmaster at 17 is going to be a burden. We think it's perfectly justified for people to set time-bound goals for themselves, right? Because we think that all goals, like for whichever goals that we're talking about in our lives, do come with some amount of time foundations. That means that people do make the conscious choice of themselves, which like goes ahead and utilizes their own agency, and that thing brings them happiness. That means that me being a chess genius as a 17 gives me some amount of agency and gives me some amount of, say, happiness in becoming that chess grandmaster. Me thinking that I'm going to get a job at 21 does bring me some amount of, say, like own self-fulfillment gain, but also monetary gain, which I've expected for my family and for myself. In that regard, we think people are making that conscious choice, and it's not a burden that people are being boxed into their own identity. We think that considering everything is time bound, people have and should have the ability of making this conscious choice if that brings them happiness. Second, it's also true, it's real. Like, you only have limited time for like to do whatever kind of things that you want to do or goals that you want to set. In that regard, we don't think that you thinking that, hey, like now time is infinite or time is not finite, suddenly you become immortal, right? Therefore, there's this symmetric harm that exists in you understanding that the time that you're here for is still going to be finite. We don't understand that how people would suddenly think that, hey, like they're here for this infinite amount of time. We don't get this idea. We don't get the relevance of this idea, neither any kind of logical link for the same. Second, their idea becomes that, hey, people would get repulsed to the idea of change to start with. You'll start like get boxed into their reality. Therefore, their idea is that you create some amount of inertia which causes loss in agency. We don't understand that if people think that time is finite, suddenly they would lose all motivation to do something about it. We think that we, on a counterfactual, give you a better idea as to how it creates an aspiration for you to at least find a better future for yourself, knowing that the time that you're here for is limited, right? We think that people would be incentivized to like join battles, etc., only if they know that the time of suffering is limited, that the amount of time that racism exists and has tarnished my life is limited. At that point in time, even if I'm going to like probably die before I'm ever going to see racism end, my contribution is still that something I need to make regardless, right? Second, we think that the idea of burdening themselves with another obligation to change cuts their own constructive. They're going ahead and say that like time and the idea of time being finite causes obligations to people. However, we think it's far worse on their side when they're coincidentally also arguing for people burdening themselves with other obligation to do whatever they want. In that regard, what is the final argumentation that comes on their side? People won't prioritize finding oppression. 5 responses for the same. Number 1, we think that people do prioritize fighting oppression because it gives them some amount of benefit. What is this benefit? People want to actualize the kind of rage that they have. People are genuinely sympathetic creatures. People fight other people's oppression because we think it's a moral right to do. Therefore, even if I adopt an economic perspective into dividing time like a fungible commodity, it's a moral gain and a benefit to me if I fight oppression for myself. Therefore, I'm more incentivized to fight oppression knowing that time is limited to start off with, right? It's cathartic to fight oppression. It's cathartic to be activist to multiple forms of people. Second response, you yourself concede on side opening government that your own progeny and future generation exists in the world. We think that an average human being is, say, some to a certain extent sympathetic and empathetic to them, right? In that regard, even if you know that your time here is finite, you still want to create a better world for your, say, like people in the world that follow you, right? In that regard, we think that they themselves concede to this idea, therefore their harm is mitigated. Third, even if this battle that we're fighting for is infinite, my impact in this world is finite. We think this creates an urgency, a sense of desperation in people in order to go ahead and do something about it. I've already clarified to you that why it's a moral gain for people to start with. However, we think that people are pushed into action once they come face to face with their morality, that considering that in the larger scheme of things, your contribution is still going to matter because of the kind of impact that you can have, can solve this problem, incentivizes people to act much more. Fourth, we think it's a symmetric harm, right? You know that you're going to die regardless. You don't need this belief to tell you you're immortal, right? This is not what this debate is about, right? In that case, we think that harm symmetrically exists on theirs. And fifth, we don't get any counterfactual. Having said that, what are the cases that you get on side opening opposition? 6 arguments for the same, right? In that regard, what is the first argument? We think that once you come face to face with your mortality, it creates an existential urgency into you. At that point in time, self-preservation kicks in. 2 impacts of this self-preservation. You want to create a legacy. You want to create artifacts. What do you then go ahead and do? You create scientific discoveries. You push yourself a little more in order to write the best book ever or write the best poem ever, which you want to be remembered by. And it's only natural and human. You can't call this a burden because people definitely do enjoy it and use their agency to make these choices. Number 2, we think that people genuinely use this idea of time being finite to make the world a better place for others, considering their impact is also limited. Second, we think it's a moral imperative, due to religion, that things such as charity are seen in good lives and killing, stealing, dishonesty, etc., hurting others, on an average, in general, is seen in a bad light. In that regard, once this idea of time being limited comes forth, your idea of getting face to face with this divine punishment for the kinds of things that you do increases. Therefore, 2 impacts. You start doing better things, and number 2, you stop doing bad things, right? In that regard, you're always incentivized to work in the idea of not receiving punishment in the end, but say some amount of reward in the end. Third, we think the cathartic value of time being finite is the idea that hope and happiness still exist. That means that even if you're 40 and you know that my time here is limited, and people say that like being in a marriage is a good thing to be, or like spending time with my children is necessarily a good thing, we think that people are still incentivized to even go ahead and be a part of this structure to start off, right? In that regard, we think that once you assign a positive connotation attached to marriage, which the society symmetrically does on either sides of the house, people, even if they're 40, 41, don't think that, hey, I can't marry anymore. We think they would still think that, hey, it's fine for me to think about marrying even at this age, because say time is limited, I'm here only for a limited amount of time. Fifth, we think that you would want to fight an oppression to an even greater extent, right? Because you not having to like enjoy the benefits out of it isn't the only consideration why you fight it for. But fifth, the individuals want to cherish the time a lot more on our side of the house. Why? Because you constantly tell people that, hey, don't be a cog in this machine, because you won't probably be able to like do all the kinds of things that you want to do right now in terms of like spending time with your children when you want to earn like some amount of money more when you're working overtime. We think that all these monetary considerations decrease when you understand that, hey, I only have a limited amount of time to spend with my family, go on a vacation, etc., etc. In that regard, you're incentivized to go ahead and get these gains far sooner as opposed to their side. 6, we think existential crisis to humanity like nuclear warfare, environmental things like etc. get deterred. You are incentivized to do something about them. For these reasons, extremely proud to propose.
And with that, we close the opening half of this debate, calling on the member of government to open the closing half of the round. You're here.
Just checking if I'm audible. I hope I am.
Yes, you're clear.
Yeah, okay. I am going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1, start. Panel, I think opening opposition didn't define what this narrative and status quo looks like, the narrative of what time is finite looks like, right? I think the time is finite narrative and status quo looks like the idea that there is a right timeline in your life, i.e. you must study from a particular age. 18 to 23 is to study, you must get married at 28 to 30 and then work till like you're 45 and have kids then, right? That is time is finite narrative does that on one level, but secondly it also tells you that time is finite and you must rush through absolutely everything in your life, etc., right? There is like you must like force yourself to take certain decisions at right points in time because time is finite, right? I think the second thing that opening government needed to do was tell you counterfactual. This is the counterfactual, right? In our world, time is a secondary consideration. In that, at the point in time, like time takes a backseat to other considerations such as your own pleasure, like the betterment of others, or like other things that you want to do in status quo. In that, you're able to take into account future generations, other communities, but also take into account ramifications that exist past your life as well, right? We think at the point in time you're able to like maximize choice significantly more. With that, two arguments. Number one, the micro argument from our level, which I think is extending to a large extent and doing a better job of mechanizing opening half, because I think they've been incredibly modeled thus far, right? I think in status quo, the narrative that time is finite pushes onto individuals a timeline for your life, i.e. that you must like study from age like 0 to 22 and then get married at 28 and then go get a job at like 25 and then continue to work till you die, right? And anybody who deviates from this timeline is necessarily considered either a failure or somebody who hasn't adhered to the timeline in society, and they're shamed with this regard, right? Where at that point in time you're actually the kind of narrative that this narrative pushes onto you is like manufactures your choice in that you have to adhere to this timeline, right? In our paradigm, necessarily when you don't have this timeline being pushed onto you in terms of how your life should live, at that point in time you're able to like pick certain things pick decisions in your life at certain points in time which you enjoy, right? Because in our world there is no right time to college. Sure, you after 18 you pick to work immediately and then you chose to go to college at 35. You won't be shamed for it, unlike status quo, right? We think at that point in time necessarily when an individual is able to pick the time that is appropriate for them, because we don't think there is any like overarching societal time that exists for an individual to get educated or to pick a job or whatever. We think at that point in time individuals' agency in terms of choosing what makes them happier at what given point in their life makes it significant significantly better for them. But moreover, we think that this also like allows for late bloomers and people who realize their passion later in life to pivot into other jobs or to get educated later on into life without feeling any sort of like societal shame, right? We think at that point in time, the decision making calculus that you make, it goes ahead and like is more about like long-term consequences, or at least in a very matter of fact, your timeline, your life is not bound by a certain timeline. We think to a certain extent that also allows for individual to self-actualize, but moreover, it also ensures that there's no rat race and that you have to succeed at particular specific points in time. We think at that point in time, individuals are significantly happier and individuals have a larger agency to choose and like are not bound by this like timeline, strict timeline to their life. Notice how this like takes down a large chunk of like opening up and the tension that exists in opening half, right? We think at that point in time, you're also led to this rush that is created due to the idea that time is finite, leads you to bad decisions. Bad decisions in the fact that you have to make decisions that are rushed paced in time, in that I have to select a job at a particular age or select a career education at a particular age, something, and I need to make this choice within a time bound period. In that, I don't make all the sort of considerations that I need to make in the first place. And at that point in time, necessarily you're stuck with something, stuck with a job or stuck with education that you're unhappy with, right? But moreover, we think that this also leads to another form of decision making, which is extremely harmful and leads me to my macro impact, which is extremely selfish, individualistic short-term thinking in terms of making decisions, right? And we think that when you expand this to a societal level, this becomes extremely pernicious and extremely harmful, right? Because as opening opposition says, our world is about self-preservation. I mean, that's precisely the problem, because the idea that like your life is finite, it leads to individuals acting in a self-preservative manner. This basically leads to that I must like short-term consequences are the only thing that matter to me, and we don't take into account future generations, don't take into account other communities into account. Just look at the actions in your own timeline and weigh all the impacts and the benefits that you accrue only onto yourself, right? At that point in time, you're absolutely fine with like exploiting and oppressing other people, and like in order to like further your own cause, because time is finite, I must do absolutely everything in my means necessary to go ahead and make my life better. At that point in time, necessarily the key within oppression itself becomes the idea that I must, because I have like a limited time on earth and I don't necessarily go ahead to see the consequences, I'm just going to like draw any sort of pleasure no matter the cost, right? We think that this is case in point. Like you look at the entire debate around climate change as well, right? And literally past generations thinking that time is finite, fuck it, we'll be dead anyways, how does it matter? Like we will just go ahead and destroy the environment as much as we want. That is also status quo with older generations continuing to do the same thing, right? They'll continue to pollute the environment, ensuring that future generations can't live in it either way, but they don't care because they won't be alive anymore and they won't necessarily live to see the consequences. At that point in time, necessarily, we think it becomes impossible for like long-term change, because the excuse is that, listen, we got, for like current generations as well, is that, listen, we got things the way they are right now, and we don't think that we're able to change things as they stand today, and we just like give up and just like concede to it, right? We think at that point in time, this accession to this failure doesn't happen on our side, simply because of the idea that you don't consider time as finite, but moreover, like more willing to take into account future generations into your decision-making calculus, because you don't recognize that time is necessarily finite. But moreover, we think that the decision-making calculus of individuals itself is like increased to like take into account like future ramifications which may occur within their own timeline, within their own lifespan itself, right? Case in point, like individuals who are alive right now won't necessarily continue to like pollute the environment and use cars every single day, because they know like within like 10 years that like the environment is going to be completely destroyed and could become absolutely unlivable, right? However, now since their lives are not bound by this timeline and they don't have to continuously aren't forced into decision making processes to rush their life, we think at that point in time necessarily they're not going to do these sorts of things, because time is rather a secondary consideration as opposed to others, right? But moreover, on a more like grounded level, we think that policies in terms of government as well as large scale policies become significantly better, right? Why? Because the electorate as a whole also views policies on the basis that they have to like create long-term change, because they prioritize that significantly better. At that point, significantly more at that point in time, short-term policies that like affect or run for like 10 years or 5 years, or even tokenistic policies that are mainly an eyewash mechanism, are no longer accepted, because the electorate as a whole and individuals in society simply don't accept that as like a good policy. We think this also increases the propensity of better policies being made, because we no longer like rush towards making policies, but rather take our time in terms of considering the larger long-term ramifications of a particular policy, but also like slightly take more time in terms of and may weigh weigh all considerations in a debate better. At that point in time, you're able to make better policies. And we think at that point in time, you're having larger level structural impact in society. So why do we take this debate over opening half? Number one, you provide your counterfactual, but also like do opposition, opening up the job by telling you the narrative of finite time, how it looks like in status quo. We also tell you and mechanize to you how on a micro level this affects individual and state experiment manufacturer's choice, and why agency is significantly better on our side, but also on a macro level necessarily how oppression as well as like self-preservative behavior no longer happens because you no longer consider yourself at the end. And in terms of also policies being significantly better off and being able to change the world. Never been prouder to propose.
Thank you for that speech, MG. We now go on to the first speaker of CUO, member of COP, please. You're here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep, clear.
Okay. Two extensions from closing opposition. Firstly, who does this belief uniquely impact? Secondly, why this push is particularly important to the young and particularly the most vulnerable of the young population. Before all rebuttals and weighing would be incorporated into my speech, but before I move on to my first extension, I just want to briefly take CG out of this debate. There are two reasons as to why CG is out. Firstly, their claim about timeline and why the creation of timeline is problematic. I don't think they ever mechanized why the narrative that time is finite necessarily leads to the creation of timeline in the first instance. They provide no mechanistic work there. So I think this claim just isn't substantiated in the first instance, out of the debate. Second of all, I think their claim that time is finite and therefore people would run to self-preservation is really like a weird claim, because it's not that you only exist for 1 month under our paradigm, right? People recognize that they exist for 70 years. So I think long-term change exists symmetrically on the other side of the house as well, because people realize that climate change would have an impact on their life, despite the fact that your life is not infinite. So first extension, who does this belief uniquely impact? Our claim is that people who are old or middle-aged have an incentive to put in their effort anyways. So the target of this debate ought to be the young people who don't necessarily have an incentive, alternative incentives. And that's for two reasons. Firstly, I think death is symmetric on both sides of the house. If you're 10 years old, death seems pretty distant into the future. You don't really see it as an urgent problem. But if you're 50 years old or 60 years old, you see death as more realistic, and therefore this incentive and urgency is created for these people anyway on the both side of the house. Second of all, the experience of failure and therefore suffering is symmetric on both sides of the house as well. So if you go out to society, you obviously experience certain failures. For example, you went on job hunting, but you only got an unstable job with particularly low pay. These experiences are attached to the choice that you make as an adult to go to society, to be a functional member of society. So I think this experience necessarily creates an incentive for people who are old, who are adults on the either side of the house anyway. So the conclusion of this is, I think this particular narrative uniquely impacts the young to a significant degree. That's because obviously exploration of life isn't visceral to them. That's also because these people are oftentimes protected from the society by the way of parents, for example, who are always protective of their children. They always encourage children to stay happy, stay optimistic about their life on their side of the house. What does this contribution mean in this debate? I think what this means is that both OG's and OO's general claim that people would make a better use of time is a really marginal discussion in this round. That's because they failed to identify, both of the teams in opening, they failed to identify why this particular push was the tipping point of different incentives that exist on either side of the house. So I think the failure of their side of the opening house is to prove why this incentive was particularly significant necessarily reduces and trivializes all of the impact of opening debate. Second extension, why then is this push particularly important to the young and particularly the most vulnerable people of the young? Our claim is that people will continue to postpone making effort until they're beyond the point of no return under their side of the house. Why is this true? First, I think this is true because of the narrative that they create on their side of the house, which is to say time is infinite, it will never run out. Therefore, you have no incentive to make that effort, to put in that effort right now, because you can do it anytime in future. Second of all, I think people generally have a tendency to prioritize ephemeral benefits because they cannot imagine nor experience future benefits by sacrificing your short-term benefits, i.e. things like studying, right? So I think under their side of the house, people really don't have an incentive to put in the effort at this point of time, particularly if you're young, you do not have any alternative incentives to push you to working hard. What does this mean? This means you do not take classes seriously under their side of the house, for example, and instead spend time with your friends forever, not acquiring any knowledge in schools. You're unable to properly go to a good university. You're probably unable to acquire the necessary skills through vocational schools, for example, to actually land a job under their side of the house. Notice that this is particularly important for the most vulnerable of all people, for the reason that they have no ability to utilize their connections, for example, to get a job in corporations. They literally have no safety net to rely on because their bank account is, they don't really have their money in their bank account under their side of the house, right? So I think it's important that these people are incentivized on our side of the house. And it's worth recognizing that laziness in the formative years is irreversible. And that's for three reasons. Firstly, there's no option to be re-educated to the extent you're already grown up, because public education and access to things like scholarship, for example, are limited to the young people who still haven't gotten the opportunity to be educated in the first instance. So like the likely scenario is that if you're old and you realize the importance of education, you cannot afford it because it's not free. It's not freely provided to you anymore under their side of the house. Second of all, learning is a cumulative process, right? If you hadn't been studying for a very long time in your childhood, you have too much to do because you have to cover all of the curriculum through your primary school, middle school, etc. That creates a huge mental barrier which hinders you from entering the education in the first instance. But you don't really know where to start because there's just too much to get at. But the third reason is because learning is a sequential process, right? So if you don't have enough or sufficient literacy or numeracy because you didn't put in the work necessary in your formative years, you cannot start even if you had the incentive to start, because you literally don't understand what textbooks say because you didn't acquire the necessary knowledge in order for you to be able to interpret and therefore understand those materials in your formative years. Why is the comparative better on our side of the house? We think the fact that the narrative that we create, which is that time is finite, necessarily creates a sense of urgency, and I think this urgency is important because it's going to be created in a way that is reflective of the regret of the older generation. So they're more likely to incentivize you to actually put in the work in your formative years. They're actually more likely to incentivize you to put in the effort that is necessary in order for you to land a job into the future. Those incentives do not exist under the world of opposition, under the world of government, where there's literally no incentive, no push, no internal and external pressure that incentivizes these people to put in the necessary effort. Because what people can say is that, if I'll have time in future, I can do certain things anyway in the future to avoid these consequences, which is obviously not true because we just disproved that is not true. I want to engage with OG and weigh our case against OG. Their case is social movement. I have 4 responses. Firstly, I think the incentive to change exists either ways because a lot of suffering presumably is a huge incentive for you to stop that suffering from tormenting you either way. I think OG's response was, people think it's not worth the time, but I would argue suffering is a much more urgent and tangible incentive. So I think that is just a stronger incentive than time is not, it's just not worth the time. Second response, I think OG's interpretation of this narrative is particularly weird because the narrative that time is finite is fundamentally compatible with the narrative that society would continue to exist beyond my life. It is therefore unclear why their case about, people not believing in the future generation was a thing in this debate in the first instance. Third response, I think they actually disempower social movements because if people believe that I don't have to act now because time might change something into the future to my favor, then why is there any urgency that exists under OG to push people to work, right? I think that urgency only exists, which pushes people to work harder under our side of the house. Fourth response, even if none of these are true, I think OG gives no mechanism for why social movements are effective under their side of the house. Our case is that we directly empower the most vulnerable because we pressurize these people and incentivize these people to work harder. I think it's more important because it's more certain and more concrete as a benefit than the speculative benefit that OG stands for. For all of those reasons, I think we've clearly taken this debate.
Thank you for that extension. We now go on with the last speaker of government side. Tabla, please. Here.
Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
All right, just give me 30 seconds if you don't mind. All right. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. First, there's going to be a bench comparative, then general comments on CO case, then targeted rebuttal on CO's case. Fourthly, engagement with opening opposition. But what are the bench comparatives? First, OG only talks about individualistic theme and how this narrative affects individual choices with little to no analysis on macro level framing with respect to decision making and impacting, which we have done in this particular debate and hasn't been engaged with either by O or CO. We additionally provide you a counterfactual in this debate, something which leads to a better decision making as time and its finiteness doesn't remain primary societal consideration to make individual or collective choices. Thirdly, we are the only team which then ensures long-term, intergenerational, organic change and policy making, which won't ever exist in ops world, especially when people make short-term selfish decisions and help and also recognize the fact that any decision made in their world is going to be rather surface level and tokenistic with no tangible impact whatsoever, something which op bench hasn't engaged with. Then coming to general comments on closing opposition's case. Life is forced to a timeline that must be adhered to because the timeline in itself is finite in their world, and you must therefore adhere to it. CO says we didn't mechanize this particular concept, but then again goes on to say that you must do things according to the certain timeline, like for example, studying at a certain age, ergo, therefore conceding to the fact that time's finiteness actually dictates how you choose your life. And this is exactly where our case began as to why exactly this narrative in itself becomes problematic. Secondly, on how then, therefore, this agency and choice is therefore constrained by forced timeline, which is not even decided by you, but it is imposed on you by the society, because this is not about individualistic choices, but rather about narratives as a matter of fact. Let's talk about their extension on laziness, postponement, and laziness and postponement, job creation for the young, learning is gradual, yada, yada, yada. We don't say the time is infinite. And it's a shame that CEO had not engaged with our counterfactual and macro level impacts yet. It's too late for WIP to do so. If at all their case is future consideration, then they knife their opening, which talks about how individuals ought to make escapist decision as time is finite itself. This inherent tension between both opening opposition and closing opposition should be enough for closing government to win this particular debate. But then again, further rebuttals. Consequences of your action will still be imaginable in our world, simply because society is still going to remain capitalistic and is still going to be expected by your parents and the society at large to have certain means to survive, certain job, etc. If that is the case, the only point of differentiation in their world and in our world is that the society dictates how exactly you need to function under the consideration of finiteness of time, but we allow individual agency for all the individuals, not just young people, but also late bloomers who thought it is right for them to go ahead and join college at the age of 40. In our counterfactual, it becomes significantly better, largely because now other things are being taken into consideration instead of societal imposed narrative of how an individual should exercise their agency, taking only time into account, because we also take into account finiteness of life, individual pleasure, finiteness of resources, and consideration of other people's happiness as well in this particular narrative. And therefore, even if closing opposition's argument in the best case scenario creates a lazy individual, we won't call that individual a lazy individual, but rather a late bloomer, simply because that individual in our world, when this particular narrative is not the primary narrative in the society, is still able to exercise their choice to get a job, even if they wish to take this particular job in their late 40s and 50s. Therefore, we incorporate their most vulnerable stakeholder better in our world, and therefore I think CO is definitely out of this particular debate. But then let's talk about opening opposition's weird case on legacy, catharsis, extremism, banality, and moral decision with time as a deterrent. All these arguments are basically culminating into short-term individualistic exercise of agency, to the point that these very optics are what forces individual to make selfish choices at the cost of other people's suffering. This legacy then comes at the cost of catharsis of others. Take example of us exploiting resources left, right, and center, not caring about our own children or future generation or even oppressed communities in the status quo. This legacy is absolutely intangible and irrelevant in this debate, largely because you won't ever be there to see the impact of your actions and how people react to your actions, which you furthered because you wanted to establish your legacy. But understand the further absurdity and tension in their case in creating this legacy or exercising certain morally good action. Either you can focus on your short-term escapist pleasure for your life, thus making selfish life choices, or you can do certain things which create your legacy. That is, ultimately, time in their world is never the deterrent which determines moral action. But let's say this banality and desire to create legacy still exists as in an individual. It basically cements a savior complex in that individual and makes them believe that how they perceive certain things should be solved and ought to be through their limited optics formed by limited lived experiences are the perfect solution to other people's life. And hence, this will never be adequate or favorable for recipients of the banality of this particular legacy. Because even if you think you're doing something good for others by creating this legacy, those people ought to accept that particular legacy and banality at the first place and consider it to be something which is beneficial for them at the first place. No catharsis therefore exists, especially when finiteness of time becomes the driving force, because we refuse to recognize the value of contentment and sacrifices and how these things can also bring joy to us. Then they talk about breaking chains of oppression. And let's take their best case scenario. We agree that there will be some individuals who would be able to break these chains. But then opening opposition has never characterized how collectivization happens and these individuals become initiators of collective change once they break these particular chains. This collective change is impossible in their world because finiteness of time itself limits individuals' choice to protecting themselves and once done, trying to not fall into this particular exploitative trap again. No banality in post-oppressive action occurs simply because the individual's limited choices to prioritize themselves because of the finiteness of time being imposed in their psyche again and again and again. Then they talk about time-bound goals and aspirations, something which even CEO talks about. I don't understand why can't individuals make it a consideration for themselves, and why exactly do we want the entire society to follow this particular way of life? This narrative is terrible for individual aspiration, largely because these time-bound goals are not decided by the individual, but by the society at large. Ultimately, ours is the only side which is able to give you not just macro level change in terms of exercise of certain sort of agency, but also with respect to how society is not going to impose a certain sort of lived experience or certain sort of choices which you ought to make as an individual. And therefore, when this narrative doesn't exist, it doesn't just help individuals across the spectrum in our life, because they can still consider this particular consideration of time being finite in our world, but it also translates to the fact that the changes which happen are not just generational in nature, but intergenerational in nature, taking into account our obligation to future generations as well, and also to the infiniteness of time as well. Our counterfactual was never that the time should be infinite. Our counterfactual was the fact that this particular finiteness in itself should not be prioritized as a primary narrative in the society, and other things like, for example, finiteness of resources, exploitation of labor, exploitation of other individuals, etc., should take the pedestal instead of time being a consideration, which in itself is quite absurd in nature. For all these reasons, we believe that we have won this debate comfortably. Proud to propose. Oh,
Thank
Hi,
you
I
can
for
you
didn't
that,
please
realize
let
it
the
was
Goblet.
LO in?
7:45. The timer was
Sorry.
saying 7:18. Sorry.
Apologies for everyone here. There was a delay in timer earlier, like the one flashing on the screen. So I just had the backup timer working in, through the chat box. And I think LO is trying to get into the Zoom call.
They're here now. They've been let in. Thank you.
Okay, that's good. Thank you for that, Gob Whip. That concludes the Gob Bench. We now go on with the last speaker for opposition. Output, please. You're here.
Hello, am I audible and visible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, thank you. So I'll be taking POIs in the chat. I will take one from opening government. I prefer them in the chat, but if it seems like I'm not recognizing your POI after 5 minutes and 30 seconds or so, do feel free to vocalize your POI so that I'll notice you and I'll take you. Okay, just give me a second. Sorry. three things in this speech. Firstly, why we take over opening opposition, nextly engaging with CG, and lastly, killing OG. So firstly, why do we take over opening opposition? I think that this is mainly for two reasons. Firstly, everything that opening opposition talks about is symmetric, right? As in the desire to create a legacy, the desire to not want to go to hell and therefore be moral, the desire to not be oppressed and to leave your domestic husband. I think that these are things that cause people pain, and in either paradigm, people want to leave anyways, right? And opening opposition never proved why these incentives didn't exist in the government paradigm. So like, we just don't understand why any of it is exclusive. But secondly, moreover, they have literally zero impact, right? Because they claim that, you can see beautiful things, you can make scientific discoveries, you can be moral. They don't talk about why any of these things are important or why they improve the quality of lives, the quality of the lives of the people as a whole, right? Compare that to what Tota gave you, right? When we told you that without this narrative, young people who are particularly in an important stage of their life are not incentivized to do things like basic studying, do things like basic working hard, right? What this means is that these people find themselves 40 years old, working inside of a factory job, and find that they have no time, they have no basic skills, no teacher to tell them how to actually get an education and to climb up that social ladder. You constrain them to a life of poverty, and that is something that is uniquely soft when you tell people that you only live once, that you're only young for so long, so you have to make do of every single day you have in school in order to work hard and climb up the social ladder. That is something that uniquely came from our side of the house and was mechanized and impacted beyond anything that came from opening opposition. So nextly, let's engage with closing government. So they had three claims. Firstly, they said that this forces people to abide by a timeline. Firstly, like, I'm actually confused about this argument because it's unclear why the narrative that your time on this earth is limited means that you are told that you must get married by the age of 30, right? Literally, there's no mechanization as to why this narrative in the motion specifically leads to the constraining timeline that they're talking about. So I think that's already enough to kick them out. But secondly, it's just unclear to me why this timeline is bad, right? Like, if you get married by 40, that's probably good because you can have healthy kids only when you're like until 35. If you study by 20s, that's the good thing because Tota told you why it's important to study while you're young. So we would argue that in fact, this timeline is not necessarily a bad thing. But lastly, in comparison, their best case scenario is that a person could get married at 50 years old instead of 30 years old. Our best case scenario is that a poor person is able to not live in poverty because they studied while they were young and actually got a good paying job. I would argue that this is a far, far more important impact than getting to choose when you get married. I think this argument is out. Secondly, they said that the majority will oppress the minority in order to maximize their current happiness. Firstly, I think it's unclear why the limitation of time in your life is the reason why people oppress others in the first place, right? I think that this is also because, for example, the rich want to make sure the poor work for really cheap wages because it obviously allows us to maximize their profit. I think it's the perception that women and Black people are inherently inferior or that LGBTQ people are disgusting. Like, I think that there are millions of other factors that create reasons for people to do oppression in the first place. So even if you remove this one little factor, I'm unsure as to what the change in the status quo is actually going to be, right? But secondly, I think it's symmetric, right? Because people still know that they're going to live for like 40 years. It's not that they think that their time is limited to 5 minutes. So it's unclear why they're in a frantic rush to oppress people. But lastly, I'm just unsure why, like, people, for example, oppressing Black people necessarily helps them utilize their time better. Like, I assume that that's true for a small number of races, but for the majority of time, they would probably rather study or spend time with their family instead of spending all their precious time oppressing Black people. So it's just unclear. Lastly, they had this weird point about long-term policy and that being good. I'm unsure as to why it is good if short-term policy happens and people benefit from it right now. Like, I think that's the same as people benefiting from it 100 years into the future. So that argument was just weird. CG is dead. So nextly, let's engage with opening government, right? Opening government had about 2-3 arguments. Firstly, they said that people will be constrained to certain identities, like a chess prodigy being stuck inside of chess. Firstly, it's symmetric because the mechanism they gave to this is sunk cost, right? Because you invested a lot of time, you don't want to give it up. That's symmetric. In their paradigm, people still invest like 30 years of their life into doing things like chess or inside of a company. So it's unclear why people are willing to give it up so easily just because they believe time is finite. But secondly, it's unclear why this is bad. If you're good at chess and you build a career on it, if you're in a stable job at a company and you continue to work there for 30 years, I would argue that that's a good thing because you have stability in your resources and you have stability in your income. It's unclear why any of these things are bad. But lastly, I would just say that constraining somebody to an identity might be bad, but it's far worse to constrain people to a life of poverty and no opportunities because they didn't work hard when they were young. I would argue that is a far bigger impact than anything that was brought by OG. But secondly, they argue that we would have social movements on our side of the house. And they had two mechanisms for this, right? They said that people don't care in the status quo because they don't think they'll benefit within their lifetime. And at the point where they think beyond their lifetime, they're going to work hard. Firstly, it's unclear why people don't care in the status quo, right? Because firstly, like people reasonably know that they're going to live for another 40 or 50 years. So they probably want to, get rid of oppression during that lifetime because they're suffering from oppression right now. But secondly, it's unclear why change takes time, because notice that OG actually only asserted that change takes time. I think that doing things like votes and petitions and protests are things that pressure governments and corporations that are existing right now to change oppressive structures. So these are things that can immediately benefit people on the ground. So it's unclear why these people cannot reap benefits of fighting against oppressive structures within that generation, right? But secondly, even if this wasn't true, right, it's unclear why these people care about the next generation, because you still are not stupid. You know that the next generation is not you. You are not some person who lived 300 years ago. So it's unclear why you care about the benefits of the next generation, or why you care about anything beyond your lifetime to the extent where it still doesn't benefit you. And all of the analysis coming from OG is symmetric, right? Take a POI from OG now.
But what exactly is going to be the trade-off on your side? Kindly engage in the worst case, wherein people do think that this isn't going to happen, because there are many people that do think these things for all the reasons I already said.
Yeah, I'll engage with that my second layer of analysis, right? Secondly, they said that oppression will be over anyway, so people are disincentivized to work hard. But again, at the point where they're going to live for another 40 years, and they know that they're going to suffer for another 40 years if they don't take away these oppressive structures, like I'm unsure as to why they won't work hard, right? But lastly, and this was engaging with their best case scenario, that people will be disincentivized, right? Notice that at best, they prove that collectivization happens. They never prove why collectivization works. We argue that collectivization, even in their best case scenario, is unlikely to bring any benefits, because firstly, like not everybody is a feminist. Not every Black person is likely to participate in a BLM protest because they have to do other things like work. Secondly, because white people and powerful people control things like politics and corporate structures. But lastly, because rich corporations are able to do things like lobby governments, for example, to only pay poor people like extremely low wages. We argue that the powerful already control society. So even if the poor like collectivize, it's unlikely that they're going to be able to create any change, right? We argue that the speculative benefit that you might be able to upturn oppressive structures is far less certain than the solution that we provide for disadvantaged people, i.e. actually working hard within the oppressive structure that exists, i.e. doing things like studying hard, doing things like working within corporations to try to climb up the social ladder by gaining things like trust, by gaining things like skills, by gaining things like a high school or a college diploma. These are far more certain ways for people to actually improve their lives, or for minorities to actually better themselves, compared to the speculative benefits that opening government and closing government also claims. We comprehensively take this debate.
And with that, we wrap up the grand finals of Credence. We will now virtually cross the House debaters.
Hi, you can use the 101 delib room for deliberation. The judges you can on Discord for the finals deliberations.
Thank you so much, guys. I'll stay there.